So, good morning. I'll try to be brief because the previous speakers were long, and we still have one more to go. So, in the interest of that, allow me to briefly present who I am and what I will try to explain in the next few minutes. As mentioned, I work for the European Center for Minority Issues, which is a research institution, worried with issues about minorities, and minorities and their representation, and obviously what states do to help or not help them. So in that sense, and I think it boils down to what all of us are trying to argue here, is reflect on the ways that we can think that minority difference can and should be managed. In that sense, my own expertise is in religion, so I will use that as a field to apply a little bit of my thinking regarding the ways that NTA can relate with state and state recognition of minorities. Picking up a few of the themes that were tackled by the very first speaker, who was a philosopher, but also, for those of you that didn't listen, there was one of the criticisms, or one of the ambitions, if you want, of NTA that was raised in the keynote was, how do we escape the straitjackets of the current scientific environment? How do we move beyond that and try to think more creatively and more pragmatically about difference and minority-majority relations? So I'll start from that premise, and I'll argue here in this paper for the purposes of this talk today from the perspective of the state. So what can the state could do, and why should the state start listening, if you want, to proposals that aim to push non-territorial autonomy forward? And by the way, so that you know, this is not something that this group is only worried about. Other disciplines have a lot to say about it, and I will come to that should the case be. Can we move on? So instead of an introduction, my starting point is this. We are living in a new cultural moment when it comes to religion. And we live in an environment where the state is not the only institution shaping norms within society. You also have the market, you have non-state actors, of which religious organizations and faiths are an integral part. And therefore, we can no longer say that the state is alone. Now, what becomes a little bit more pressing now, as we live in a super diverse world, is to conceptualize the role of the state when it manages cultural difference, including on the basis of religion. What has changed? This is, I think, a very important thing to highlight, because some of it we don't realize, although we live in a world dominated by it. We are living in a world where religion has declined, at least in our continent, at the exception, perhaps, of the rest of the world. We live in a world where religious actors, churches, and the like are heavily involved in healthcare, in education, and in the provision of social services. I am sure you came across examples of emergency action during the COVID pandemic by religious actors, so you know that these actors are claiming more and more space. You also probably have noticed that activism is more and more grounded on religious identities. So what you believe kind of propels you ethically and morally to contribute to society. And then at the same time, you have traditional sources of religious authority in decline. People believe and belong in very different selective ways. You don't believe in the same way like your grandparents do, if you believe at all, that is. So you see what I'm trying to say here. And then you have other stuff like digitalization affecting the way that the state works and that we live as parts of states. And then we have finally the point about religion being also a moral thing, so linked to the common good, how we envisage a world of harmony, but also everyday life, how we live our life, how we dress, how we eat, how we behave, how we gather, how we worship. So in that sense, these are the things that define this new cultural moment. Next slide, please. Okay. What I'm trying to do with this paper is focus on the exchange between the state and religious minority groups. Why? Because it is an opportunity to do four things that you see on this slide. Understand and assess the tensions. Am I doing something wrong? The tensions related to identity in modern liberal societies. So what makes it difficult to live together, essentially. Understand the implications of the fact that religious actors are becoming more active, more creative, more, if you want, assertive in claiming public space in multicultural contexts. The third aim is to study the shift of the role of the state, so how the state should change its position from moderator, so a little bit like the referee in a football game, to a partner. And a partner in accentuating the positive, not in, promoting structural discrimination and inequalities the way that they have existed so far. Final aim is to emphasize how the recognition of minority faiths and the recognition of the work of religious actors, or if you want, the fact that we put them into the system, is connected to new parameters of diversity management. Next slide. So with that in mind, so my background and my aim, the first thing that I think merits a little bit of reflection here is how do we pluralize religious identity through state recognition? And for that, usually, in academic papers, you need a theory. My theory comes from someone who is relatively well known in diversity management, and his name is Steven Verdovec. He invented the concept of super diversity, which says the following thing in simple terms. Only a situated, contextualized perspective, so only when you look at the background, the context of the action of a religious actor and how they act, are you in a position to understand the real kind of claims, the real nature of the claims that states are confronted with. So you have to take into account as a state, because now we are positioning ourselves in the place of the state. You need to not only worry about religion, but also gender, socioeconomic conditions, things like that. Things that make us what we are in terms of our social positionality and what we can do and how we can claim our rights. It's not just the fact that I'm an Orthodox or you are a Muslim that kind of, defines us. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And why is that important? Because the state has to deliver public service for all. Not just for the majorities, but for the minorities as well. So if the state wants to achieve inclusive policies and distribute goods in a more, responsive and fair way, then it is important to understand this super diversity and this positionality, as we say, of people. And then, only then will it be possible to accommodate the fact that today people have more than one identities. So, for example, you can be a Muslim British or a British Muslim. It doesn't have to be incompatible between one identity between the other, or a lesbian Muslim British. Do you see? So, multiple identities, space for accommodation. The state has to start responding to that in the light of the fact that it wants a space of cohesion and not a space of separate ghetto groups. Next slide, please. So in that space, you have minority agency. Now, let's go back to religion for a moment. In the next 2 decades, according to the World Economic Forum reports, and that's a relatively old one from 2016, the number of faith adherents will increase. What does that mean? People will believe, there will be more believers, if I'm to simplify, but because there will be more believers, there will be more possibilities for mobilization and for religious actors to act and preach or apply or even, act upon a sets of beliefs that will support social change. So more mobilization, more action, more activism, if you want. Why? Because religious actors operate as de facto trust networks or as distributors of natural resources, and they have, multiple tasks, even provide public state services. So they have a very wide range of activity. Migrants and members of religious minorities within these states, even in our continent, in Europe, at the same time have learned now that we're in the second, third, or even fourth generation of immigrants to resist assimilation. And they do so not because only of being oppressed, but because of cultural issues. And religion is, I believe, part of culture, despite what people may believe or say to the opposite. So here it is important to look at the capacity for these people to make choices that affect their ability to change their situation, but also the satisfaction of being what they wish to be. And that's the definition of agency that you see on the slide. So the exchange between state and religious actors has to happen. And one of the ways that the literature suggests, and other much brighter people suggest that this can happen, is through a set of values. I think someone asked that question before. These values are called operative public values. So our values which at a given point in time and space, so geographically and also in temporal terms, work between the different groups that are in the picture, if you want. And they are not fixed and therefore not static. And they evolve over time because culture evolves over time. So it's a deal that gets renewed when circumstances change. Final point that I wish to make, and I don't think a lot of minority scholars make that. Minority agency is not just about culture and identity, and I don't think we should fool ourselves to think that that is the case. It is also about socioeconomic policies. It is about the extent to which you have access to education, healthcare, public service employment, and all of that. Why? Because what we usually don't hear is that most of the conflicts between minorities and majorities happen for resources. They don't happen for culture necessarily. Access to resources. So in that sense, I think it's important to keep in mind how the equation works. Next slide, please. So why do states recognize minority claims? One of the important reasons is to avoid conflict or to fix conflict, so as a resolution tool. However, recognition in minority rights is something, at least legal recognition, is something that is not always a guarantee for agency. So if the state recognizes you're a minority, you're a religious minority or other minority, it doesn't mean that this minority or this group will be able to act, to be more active, to assert itself in the social space. Sometimes you have scenarios where you have groups being even more isolated once they become recognized because they're inward looking. One very good example, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the guys with the hats and, the conservative Jews, the very conservative Jews. So in that sense, minority agency does give us, and state recognition work together, but not in absolute terms. And then the other thing that I wanted to raise is that we also, as those of us that are lawyers, we also turn very often to the judicial fora to see how, you heard it in the previous presentation, to see how, if you want, the state can be pushed towards recognizing or understanding minority claims. I think that judicial fora are traditional means of religious minority claim making, but what happens when we have minorities that operate outside the overview of the state? This is a whole body of literature which is called non-state endorsed self-regulation, and it's a problem in Western societies, at least in Western Europe, the Muslims, bluntly. So you see how that works. We even talk about parallel societies in that respect. Final point here, connecting minority agency with state recognition, is that the fact or the degree to which a state chooses to recognize or reject these processes, whether they're formal or informal, is ultimately a governance issue that transcends beyond law, beyond economics, beyond sociology. It is an existential issue for a state. Next slide, please. Now, I said at the beginning that one of my aims was to look at how, or to argue how the state could change its approach when or should change its approach, as a matter of fact, when managing religious diversity. The usual solution in Europe is to recognize religious diversity by constitutional command, in constitutions. You probably have an article saying religious freedom is recognized, people can do this, that, and the other. Exists in multiple variations within and beyond Europe. But I'm just saying here that the way that this works, whether we talk about a liberal state, the usual format is religious tolerance or the state is supposed to be neutral, or whether we talk about the non-liberal response. And by non-liberal, I don't mean illiberal. Do you understand the difference? Non-liberal is a system that is based on a communitarian recognition of groups, not an individual rights approach. So the non-liberal responses use legal and soft law means to bring together religious groups. It's very common in Southeast Asia. If you look at, for example, Singapore, you see the aim is not individual rights, is social harmony. And how do you do that? You argue at the level of groups. So anyhow, no matter which approach you take, you don't address the shifting parameters of the role of religion. So the what has changed slide that I showed you earlier. Why? Because you only, in the first case, you don't actually address enough the social dimension of religion, or in the second case, you are liable as a state to manipulate your power to, regulate groups for your own political purposes. So it is unsatisfactory. So at best, what you have in the end is a state which promotes individual rights. Next slide, please. Earlier speakers, and I think the keynote speaker as well, talked about the role of decentralization. I argue that it's not a guarantee for religious diversity management processes, although there is a lot of literature that says that the territory within a state, autonomous provinces, different solutions, can be a basis for the protection of differences. Of course, this network is part of this. We also pro non-territorial approaches. Again, I think the aim is to increase involvement of citizens in the decisions that affect them, whilst at the same time bringing the state closer to the citizen. It's a little bit the cities scenario that we heard earlier in the paper. What are the problems with decentralization? It does have side effects, like most, medication, issues of competence, lack of resources to implement minority-specific policy, and sometimes coordination challenges. So it's not perfect. And on top of that, it does leave unanswered a few questions, which is the degree of protection of public manifestation of religions, state support, so money and support in kind towards public religions with engaging and competing in the public sphere, whether it's in schools, hospitals, or other social services. Therefore, decentralization, I think, should be treated with caution. Next slide. And then we come to the question, okay, what should the state do in light of all of that? How should the state become aware of the changing environment? And I've put down a few points, a few hints, if you want, that suggest that the state is under pressure to consider alternative approaches to the ones that we have so far in order to manage religious difference. First, we have a growing religious self-identification of people. People believe, as I said, in more complex ways. Then we have the link between territory and religion, which is defied through globalization. You heard that also from other speakers. So people resist to integrate, but at the same time, retain transnational links with their kin state, perhaps, or their kin religion. We have also the point of balancing communitarian demands, so the demands of the group, the rights, the collective rights of the group with liberal democracies, and there's a clash very often. We have public presence, I mentioned that, of religious communities that has increased, and on top of that, we have very often religious actors producing positive outcomes, regardless of what, how we are trained in Europe to think that the state and religion are two things that, they don't like each other. They should stick apart. Value of community, solidarity, corporate action aiming at common good are some of the positive actions of agency of this kind, which could suggest to the state to rethink the policy. And then the final point is the missing contextualization when the state manages religious difference. And that's the contextual thing that I mentioned, Stephen Vertovec, earlier, because what we want is to eliminate structural inequality and a fair distribution of resources. Next slide. So how do we move forward? A few of the thoughts that I had in terms of further development for non-territorial autonomy are these three that you see on the slide. To combine top-up and bottom-up approaches, which, affect beyond the elites of each group, which combine legislative and institutional approaches. There's a very interesting body of literature that comes from natural resource management, which is called polycentricity. So you have multiple centers managing one public good. And that's very interesting. There's also another line of thought which grows in parallel with NTA called network governance. So we operate as networks when we manage things. And these networks and these polycentric systems combine state, non-state, international bodies, civil society. So it's a more complex way to resolve and protect identities, resolve problems and protect identities. Then another condition is the inclusion of liberal and traditional practices in the process of deliberation. Now this, not a lot of people agree with, because why do you include radicals in the dialogue? I have my views on it. You may not agree, but what I should make clear here is that we don't automatically legally recognize radical views. We just allow them to be heard, and that's all. And then the final bit is that any form of religious minority agency will not work if we don't have the relevant socioeconomic conditions that back it. I mean, look at the Roma. It is a question of socioeconomic standing. My final bit, and I'll stop, is a proposal for a new skill set for religious forms of NTA, again addressed to the state, which could be tailored along the 4 points you see, the 4 guidelines you see. One would be equality of opportunity reconciled with equality of condition. So the starting point when you raise has to be the same. It's not possible for us to achieve at the end, at the same time if one of us starts, earlier and the other person starts in front. So it's the same starting line for everyone. Cultural competence in public service provision. This is something that the Americans use since the 80s. In healthcare, for example, and it has been tested in hospitals. You need to understand better who you have in front of you, in this case as a patient, because this was, devised in healthcare. And you need to also come with more appropriate, culturally appropriate, if you want, considerations when you provide service as a state. Third point, the local provision of religious and cultural services. We heard about that. So local governments as facilitators for religious initiatives, and first instance for regulation when there is conflict, when people disagree. But all of that works only if the state understands what's going on the ground, because otherwise I don't think it's going to work. And then the final point, and with this I'll close, consultation and collaboration mechanisms between state and non-state groups to increase impact of measures taken, and also to combat inequality in line and in correspondence with how actors, religious actors in my case, behave and claim the rights, both through formal fora, but also through informal fora. And I will thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. If we have some questions regarding the Professor Topidi intervention, please.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it very much, very informative. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the conditions under which recognition of minorities as these distinct groups, as national or ethnic minorities, when in these situations it creates stability, and when potentially it creates instability in terms of negotiations for NTA or TA, for example. Because we know that if I'm looking at let's say the context of the South Caucasus, for example, there's fear that officially recognizing members of this group, that it will embolden their representatives to make greater and greater, or more specific, bolder demands, for example, and potentially then lead to a domino effect, not only within the countries, but in the region as a whole. And the second question that I had was, you had mentioned the work of Guy 1998, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I was curious if you could expand a little bit more on when territory is a basis for the protection of difference and how also for the expansion or creation of non-territorial approaches to minority right governance, or the production or the affordance of minority rights. Thank you.
So thank you for these questions. Very broad questions, I have to say, so my answer is going to be unsatisfactory. I'm warning you. In terms of, let's start with Guy first. Guy was the scholar that marked this whole discussion about decentralizing services in order to serve better communities. And that, as I tried to argue, can happen in two ways. The territorial way is usually the federal systems. I'm simplifying here just to, forms of federalization are the approaches which you see there's a lot of literature on. However, federalism is top-down, it's not bottom-up. So it has limitations to the extent that it doesn't always correspond to what communities and groups, cultural, religious, linguistic, or other, may expect from the arrangement, which then can lead to escalation like the one you described. Then there are other modalities. There's the consociationalist arrangement, which is something that which is also very widely discussed in the literature. Again, we co-decide. For some reason, this has not worked either because it's not systematized in a way which takes account of the bottom-up as well trajectory and dimension. And then there's a third approach when we talk about minority rights, which is the liberal communitarian visions of multiculturalism. I'm sure you've heard this multiculturalism thing. Somehow, Kimlicka and Taylor. Again, unsatisfactory, again because it's top-down, and again because it ignores, the more collective dimension, as I tried to say. So these are things that are, if you want, the dominant approaches when it comes to majority-minority relations. Guy would subscribe to the first of those. Now, the NTA arrangement is somehow a more experimental, in my understanding, approach to it, which has historical grounds and which aims to look at it from a more group trajectory. So the minority group affected and how efforts to, empower those groups have worked. In its current if you want, configuration, and I think Federica Brina explained that well in her keynote, it has limits. We don't have a success model. However, as I tried to also argue, it's a model it's a concern that has seen the creations of models in other disciplines that are worried with the same thing. How do we coexist without collide, essentially, without, reach a point where we can't stand each other in terms of not just cultural identity, but also, daily life. These are the current trajectories, but NTA is accused and criticized for, being very abstract. So what I'm trying to do here is to start from the bottom up. This was more theoretical, but my own work is in schools, in religious schools. So I'm trying to show how that is a form of NTA, but of the future. So just to give you a little bit of pinpoints as to how I position myself in this territory, non-territory question. Now, as for conditions, I think this what I put on the slide in my preconditions for further development of NTA is selective, inevitably. I chose to refer to only the bits that are the most obvious, if you want, because all of this is contextual. So I don't think we can come up with, a menu and you choose. I am not an expert in the region that you mentioned, so I'm not sure how to respond to that bit of the question. But what I can say is that any form of minority agency, I think, has to be included in a space of openness, not just hospitality, but in a space where we are open to arrangements that are more flexible. And as lawyers, we are trained, at least in Western European systems, to respond to the state as a central feature of the management of group relations. I think that is now time that it should start be questioned, not because the state is weaker. No, it has the power, it has the money, it all depends on it, or most of it depends on it in terms of implementation. But essentially because we need to also look at other factors that influence outcomes. And one very characteristic example, and I'll stop with this, is how the digital world is being regulated. It's well beyond states. It's someone else, it's private actors. And you see how awkward states become when they have to decide how to, do law on the basis of the fact that they are powerless in a system that they have to guarantee a certain number of rights. So